but they're not the things that we're going to exemplify and highlight. And then here's the ones that are not tolerated. And I think by starting to do that, then you have a room that someone might be showing up and leading innovation just fine, but you have room to help them grow and to say, this works, but this will work even better. This is what, this is the leadership and the behaviors we want to exemplify. And I think all three buckets are important for that reason.
Yeah, and would you say that different roles or different departments needs to emphasize different types of behaviors? If you have like five, you need more in innovation, and maybe in sales different things, and operations need different things, or they all need to comply to the same behaviors?
I think they all need to comply to the same behaviors. Now, the outputs of that, like how you're going to innovate, in your sales organization versus how you're going to innovate in operations, or how you're going to innovate in the marketing department, the output will be very different. But when we think about behaviors, we're thinking like, okay, let's say we define innovation as there's no such thing as a bad idea, just ideas that need to be explored until they're exhausted. I just made that one up. Well, you would want that same behavior if you're in marketing as if you were in sales, and you define there's a time and place. When we're brainstorming, there's no bad ideas, just ideas that have to be exhausted, and they get explored, and then they get set aside, but not because they're bad, but because they just don't happen to work for whatever it is we're trying to solve for. So I think the behaviors are the same across the organization. I think that similarity of behavior is really important. Again, what we reward and what we're not going to tolerate.
I see. And if we're talking about this gap that was like years before, and now it's like accelerated. So tell me, what has changed during these 2 years of the pandemic? How do you see that?
Well, unfortunately, I think the pandemic lowered the water level, so to speak, to show the gap. I will say I have a lot of compassion for our talent acquisition and recruiting functions. Pre-pandemic, they were able to cover for a lot of the gap. So if a leader was toxic and had a lot of turnover, talent acquisition could just keep putting people into the chairs, and no one was sort of the wiser, even though recruiting knew that was a toxic leader with turnover. The market was such that they could cover for it. Well, I think the pandemic, companies had to make a lot of choices, and not even just the decisions they made, but how they made them and how they implemented those decisions told people a lot about who they really are, what they really value. There are companies that had to do massive layoffs, but they did it in a really compassionate way. And then there are companies that handled it not so well. And I think the pandemic lowered the water level such that people are like, yeah, I thought this before, but now I really see it. I really see when push comes to shove, how you're going to be as a company and how you're going to show up. And I'm not interested. And unfortunately, now the talent acquisition and recruiting functions, they can't compensate for that. They can't compensate for cultures that have been unhealthy for a while. They can't compensate for leaders that have led in really toxic and unhealthy ways. TA and recruiting can't compensate because the water level has really revealed how big those gaps are.
Yeah, like in Israel, we have a huge problem of we don't have enough talent for all the startups and high tech in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's a big fight over talent.
Yeah.
Really, you see so many companies investing tons of money in order to advertise for employees and about their brand. And what is different, I think, that in Israel, it's such a small company and it's not small, it's a small country, and people know each other. So even if they don't go to Glassdoor or something like that, I will know someone within the company in a minute. So I know somebody who knows someone who works there.
Yes.
And it's so hard to cover that over like things that they're doing,
Right.
or managers they're taking in. So sometimes there are like great managers for their results, but not for their employees. So maybe their managers really love what they're doing, but their employees don't really like them. And that's a problem because he's measured by what he's doing and not what the employees are saying about him in many cases. So I think that in the US, especially in enterprise, it's very, people take into consideration what your peers are saying, people that are your employees, people above you. Is it like,
I don't think
no,
so, not so much. So
no?
I love the example that you talked about, because I think that's another thing that's really showing up now, is that companies have valued managers for the work and the output, but not whether they're really good people leaders. And what some examples is, it's very common for the best salesperson to get promoted to sales manager, or the person who's been in customer service the longest to get promoted to sales manager. And in the industries that are really hurting, and you mentioned one right now, technology, finance, healthcare, they have valued technical skills over people leadership skills. And so we are seeing it so prevalent here in the US, even though we have 360-degree reviews. In a lot of companies, you don't do a 360-degree review unless a problem has been noted with the leader. And that means it's got